Another test has been and gone, and we're just a week away from the first race of the 2022 season. And once again, this test has thrown up yet more controversy and interesting looking cars. So here's my 5 things we learned from the second 2022 test. My name's Andy, and this is Behind the Drive. New regulations, new innovation. There's been an aim in all of the cars over the last decade or so to shrink the size of the rear end. This so-called Coke bottle shape was always a focus of the teams, and it was getting quite impressive for some of them. But this year has been a different approach from many teams on the grid. The Aston Martin, for example, has a wider and longer side pod with a huge undercut to ensure airflow over the floor. The Ferrari has a similar concept with the addition of a dip at the top of the side pod, which manipulates the airflow as it goes towards the rear wing. You then have the opposite approach, which the Williams car has adopted, which has been to shrink the side pods as much as possible. It seems like Mercedes have taken it one step further, with a radical new approach to side pods, basically making it taller than it is wide. It's a risk for the Mercedes team going with such a radical and different concept compared to the other teams, and there were actually some comments made early on questioning the legality of the team's new concept. But whilst the approach looked incredibly exciting and radical, the team struggled with a car that was porpoising more than others on the straights, and it didn't look composed and level through the corners either. The drivers themselves are also playing down their chances, with Hamilton claiming that the Mercedes team are not in the hunt for wins as things stand at the end of testing. Something that is very difficult to believe given the team's track record of sandbagging and playing down their chances in testing. But just watching the drivers wrestle with their car to get it around the corners, it looks like it isn't just heavy fuel loads that are slowing them down. There seems to be a lack of confidence from both drivers, but you have to question whether they might be onto something with those side pods, because they, like most other teams in the sport, wouldn't go down a development path that didn't show promise in the wind tunnel. Red Bull then revealed a shrink-wrap side pod on day 3 of the second test, which looks sculpted over the radiators and engine, and this came in addition to their radical design revealed in Barcelona, which increased the length of the underside of the intake. It is yet another different interpretation of these new regulations, which is exactly what you want to see with new regulations in Formula 1, as the grid looks so different from each other. The Red Bull car immediately looked comfortable for both of their drivers, with them seeming to have a lot of confidence and putting in some pretty impressive lap times. So whilst we might not be much closer to knowing an accurate running order, one thing we do know is that the 3 teams that might potentially be at the top have created very different looking cars despite the tight restrictions from the new regulations. And for me, that innovation is definitely deserving of a green box. So there's no need to worry about whether the innovation of Formula 1 would be lost. McLaren brake issues. It was a tough second test for McLaren as Daniel Ricciardo was unwell with COVID and unable to take part in any of the second test. This meant that Lando Norris would be the only runner for that team, and that would be pretty tough for any driver from an endurance perspective, but he didn't need to worry too much as he only managed 50 laps across the 2 sessions on day 1 and just 60 laps on day 2. The reason for the lack of running was because of a brake issue that seemed to be persistent for the team throughout that first day. It meant Norris was often locking up and running straight through the corners, and it seemed like every time he would come out of the garage in the afternoon session, he'd be struggling. It turns out McLaren underestimated the speed of the 2022 cars, so as such their brake ducts aren't providing enough cooling to manage the temperatures created by the brakes being worked harder than they predicted. The problems continued into day 2 for the McLaren team as they waited for replacement parts to be sent over from the UK, but whilst they showed improvement on the final day once those parts arrived, it still wasn't great, with the team struggling to even manage a race distance before they had to bring the car back into the pits. In the end, Norris managed 90 laps on that 3rd day, an improvement but still not the kind of running that they will have wanted. It's an issue that must have been a frustration for the team throughout the Bahrain test, and the team don't exactly have a long time to fix it, with the first race being just 1 week away. The McLaren car itself looks very good, with the team not suffering as much as their rivals when it comes to porpoising, but unless they can sort this brake issue out, it won't be good for the team and it's likely that they'll retire. So it's an amber box for McLaren after a really tricky 3 days of testing in Bahrain. Before we take a look at the next points that we've learned from testing, I want to take a moment to ask you to consider subscribing to Behind the Drive. I'm aiming for 50,000 subscribers by the summer break, so if you haven't already done so, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Thanks. Red Bull now on top. Next up, we've potentially seen a new challenger put themselves ahead of Ferrari. I've already mentioned that the Red Bull team bought upgrades on day 3 of this second test, and they immediately made an impact. Both drivers looked comfortable in the car and it looked controlled and planted through the corners. They didn't have much in the way of porpoising issues like many of the other teams, and they weren't locking up the fronts anywhere near as much as their rivals. To me, this suggests that their upgrades have enabled the floor to leak less air out of the sides so they can maintain the downforce. But on top of this, both drivers were quick with this new setup. Max Verstappen set the fastest time of the test with a 1 minute 31.7, a time that would have been good enough to make it through to Q2 in Bahrain qualifying last year. But given there's an expectation that these cars will be slower than the 2021 cars, and the fact that the Red Bull will have probably been running with heavier fuel loads, I think we can be confident that this Red Bull is up there with the Ferrari as the fastest car. And you have to take your hat off to Red Bull for being able to bring an update on the final day and just make it work. It suggests that their wind tunnel and CFD data is pointing them exactly in the right direction, and may even mean that the team get faster and faster in the first few races of the season. The Red Bull wasn't faultless. Verstappen did spin going into the final corner as he was setting himself up for a quick lap, but that's the kind of issue that these drivers will very quickly iron out, and I doubt we'll see that again from Red Bull next weekend. But they've laid down a marker and set themselves up as the ones to beat in 2022. So for me, they're certainly deserving of a green box for this test. Kevin Magnussen is back. Next up, I want to talk about the newest member of the 2022 F1 grid, as Kevin Magnussen is back in Formula 1, having taken the vacant spot at Haas. And that's certainly not something that I expected to say at the start of this week. The Danish driver was immediately playing catch-up as he prepared for his surprise new drive, and it looked like he was being very aggressive with his Haas car very early on, as he learned about the new driving styles that are required to keep these cars level and generating downforce. But he did end up maximising some of the extra running that the Haas team were given, as on day 2 he went and set the fastest time of the day, and sure, the cameras were off so it was probably a low fuel run, but regardless, it was a great way to make an impact and potentially even attract a few more sponsors for that car before they head into the season. I think Kevin Magnussen is an excellent choice for Haas. The team know him already, and so he should be in a familiar environment, and he's a very experienced and talented driver. Many people, including me, thought that dropping Magnussen was a mistake at the end of 2020, because he had a lot more in him and never had the opportunity to prove himself. But this could well be his chance. It's a funny thought that he gave up his seat for Mazepin, who then funded the team's development for 2022, only for Magnussen to step back into the car to compete in 2022. Magnussen looks thrilled to be back, saying that he didn't realise how much he missed racing in Formula 1. So I hope he's able to enjoy it as much as possible this season in a hopefully more competitive car. Racing alongside Mick Schumacher, I expect he'll provide a good challenge for the German driver and be able to be a closer mentor for Schumacher, which should mean the young Ferrari driver develops well over the course of the season. And it seems like the Haas team have done okay, with a car that has some pace, but might not be so strong in the longer runs, with the team only adding 240 laps to their 160 in Barcelona. So overall, for me, it's a great move for the team to bring Magnussen back to the Haas team. So it's a green box for him for testing this week. Williams' mistakes set them back. The Williams team is keen to utilise these regulations to get themselves back into the midfield, and after the first test in Barcelona, they look really good. They managed the 5th most laps behind only the top 4 teams, but in Bahrain, the team looked a lot less competitive. This wasn't helped by the fact that the team had a rear brake failure, which then caused a rear suspension failure and a fire at the back of their car on day 2. It was an error that the team's CEO, Jost Capito, described as too stupid to talk about, suggesting it was a simple procedural error that will hopefully not happen again for the team. It meant that on day 2, they managed just 12 laps, which will have set them back considerably. The team's run plan on day 3 meant they didn't have any representative quali simulations in the cooler evening conditions, meaning they were well off the pace when it comes to lap time. This means it's difficult to work out where they stand when it comes to the pecking order, but making simple procedural errors that costed the team valuable running is not a good way to start the season, and it probably means that the team are on the back foot already. They did complete 142 laps on the 3rd day of testing, which is definitely a good step forwards, and it means they probably have a fairly reliable car, but we shall see what happens when it comes to where they stand in the pecking order. So it's an amber box for Williams for the team for now. Those are my 5 things we learned from the Bahrain test. Let me know what you think in the comments and tell me what I missed as well. And make sure you stay tuned for 5 things we learned from the Bahrain Grand Prix this time next week.